every important decision in our lives, that some of the information is just not that comfortable. And most of us, I think, are almost used to that by now, but we still get outraged at times. So if you have any questions or want me to explain how did that happen, please let me know, okay? So one quick slide on symptoms. I won't ask who has had COVID, who doesn't. You know, in most cases, you know whether you had COVID or not. So you know what symptoms, you may have experienced. But it's a pretty broad spectrum thing. There's very few things that you feel, you think, oh gosh, I have COVID. Catherine and I, my wife, both had COVID. Really, neither one of us had shortness of breath, kind of the initial classic sign. But I don't think I've ever been that tired in my life. And we got tested, we were positive, we quarantined, we recovered, and have some degree of immunity from that, in addition to the fact that we both became fully vaccinated as well. So anyway, who would, excuse me, Dr. Zirin, if you saw a patient or heard of a patient with conjunctivitis, I'm not sure COVID-19 would be near the top of the list. But it's a relatively, one of the later, but it turns out that, this is a short list. What everybody that's had COVID experienced, the list would be really long, I think. So, and not only, when I say Catherine and I recovered, I'm pretty sure we recovered. I haven't had an EKG since then. Not sure I want one, at least, real soon. But the three longer lasting syndromes, if you will, was COVID lung. People would have breathing difficulties and some deficit in their pulmonary capacity for quite a time. There's brain fog, that people have been confused, a little bit deficit in cognition, that those folks, that may last months and months, but in every case that I've heard of, they don't feel that that's permanent, that they do feel that people are recovering from that at various speeds. And then what we've heard a little bit more of is cardiac issues. Some people with COVID have had some cardiac sequelae that causes some cardiac output deficits for a period of time, but even they are thought to recover with time. What that means, however, is that, and we've already entered this, I believe, that not only has the medical community gotten pounded with millions of cases of COVID in the United States and tens and hundreds of millions of cases in the world, but the human medical infrastructure is going to be, the pounding is not going to go away quickly. Okay, so our medical infrastructure is going to take a hit for a long time. And months ago, Catherine may corroborate this, but I kind of predicted that there was, once we felt that we were coming out of the pandemic, which means probably, I'm going to guess and say soon after the holidays, we're going to experience a little bit of a surge from Thanksgiving. We're going to experience a little bit bigger surge, perhaps after Christmas. I don't think it's going to be as big as any of the previous two peaks that we've had, but I think there's going to be somewhat of a surge. But then as that begins to go down, I think there's going to be a collective sigh of relief in the world, but certainly in the United States, and people are going to say, okay, I'm glad that's done. It's not going to be done, okay? One of the things that I predict is going to happen is that we're going to see people leaving the medical professions, either through early retirement or people saying, I've had enough. And one of the other attributes of this pandemic is that we were told to stay home, and we did. And we stayed home from our normal medical appointments. We didn't get our testing done that we may have gotten otherwise. So there's going to be this bow wave of chronic conditions that are going to have to be dealt with at the exact same time that we may be looking at a deficit of primarily physicians and nurses. And so I'm not looking forward to that. I think, I'm hoping I'm wrong, Jan, I'm not sure though. But at any rate, so that's why this box says likely will create a bow wave of medical and psychological issues into the foreseeable future. Yes, Pat?
Several people I know who have been tested positive have lost their taste or smell.
Oh, yeah.
And it didn't come back. Is it one of these, I can't say that
It
word.
probably will, but COVID-19 is not the only virus that causes a loss of taste or smell. Remember when we had Dr. McCabe as our white coat speaker?
Okay.
Dr. McCabe is a veterinary classmate of mine, but he's also kind of a big hitter in the veterinary profession. And we had him come as a speaker for our white coat ceremony for our students. He lost his sense of smell probably in the early 90s from Jan, what viral thing might that have been? But it's never come back. And so, it's just, he knows it, it's not there. And what that means is, Andy can eat just about anything he wants. At least it's not going to be bad, it may not be good. So in the world right now, and I want to emphasize, officially reported, okay? Because we're talking down to the ones digit here, right? So we've had 255 million recognized cases in the world. 47 million in the United States alone, and 5 million deaths in the world, 762,000 in the United States, okay? The actual number of COVID cases in the United States is at least 10 times that amount. At least 10 times. The reason for that is a lot of people didn't get sick enough, or they got whatever symptoms and they didn't think it was COVID, or they never got sick at all, but they were still infected. So this number, and I'll use cases, is at least only 1/10 of what is actually out there. Jan?
Does that change the death rate?
Of course it does.
Thank you.
Of course it does. But again, I'll use the United States, 1.6% case fatality rate means almost 2 people out of 100 who get COVID are going to die. But that's not true. That's what's officially reported. So if you multiply this times 10, then this is going to go down to 0.16 or 0.2. So the real case fatality rate cannot be known. It's not that we're not reporting it or that it's not being calculated. We just don't have the denominator because we don't know how many cases have actually occurred. So that's why I emphasize this is officially reported. And you may recall in the news there was a lot of talk about, well, not all cases are getting reported, or some places they're not reporting. And you know something? I don't care. I don't really care, because the mistakes in the U.S. surveillance system, they're there. There's mistakes, coding mistakes, lost data for whatever reason. But as long as those errors are consistent over time, the trend picture is true. It's real. Okay, the numbers themselves may not be exactly real down to the ones digit, but the trend is pretty close to what is actually happening. Okay? And I always kind of give that caveat when I show this slide, because a disease that has a 1.6 case fatality rate, that sounds pretty low, doesn't it? Well, that's almost 2 people out of 100. That's a lot, folks. If you were to actually multiple, the entire U.S. population, losing 2% of them, that's way more than that, okay? So that's just a way for us to keep that in perspective. And the other thing that this slide reminds me of, in the last 12 months, the United States has had about 100,000 opioid deaths. So even the known figures of death in the United States eclipses opioid, at least for this short period of time, by a factor of at least 8. So in the here and now, it's all COVID all the time. But we can't forget completely about the fact that, COVID's gonna come and go. It's gonna take its time going, but it's gonna go. And we're gonna get used to it. It's gonna become a normal vaccine, and it may even become a childhood immunization in the not too distant future. So we will get control of COVID-19, barring any new variants. And I just read there's a new variant in the UK that seems to have less symptoms, but it seems to be spreading pretty quickly. So, if it comes here, we'll deal with it. And the good news about that is our current vaccines are protective against that new variant, but the problem is there's just a lot of people that aren't vaccinated. And we'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, way too long on this slide, but it's such a idea and concept packed slide that I couldn't gloss over it too quickly. So this is, as of today, this is what we call the epidemic curve in the United States since we started recognizing COVID-19 in January of 2020, almost 2 years ago. And you can see we had this huge peak about a year ago, and we're just hopefully coming out of the most recent peak, but it's coming up a little bit. It's coming up for reasons that we'll talk about in a second. And this is the death curve. Now, the height of this curve looks about the same or even higher than this curve. The numbers are different. The scale is different. Okay, the peak of deaths is way lower than the peak of cases, but to fit them on the screen. But I've made them so they kind of line up date-wise. And if you look at this closely, the peak and valleys of death occur 2 to 3 weeks after the peaks and valleys of the incidence, the illness onset, which makes perfect sense. People don't die the instant they get COVID. It's a couple of weeks, if they're going to, okay? So this is a really interesting curve. And I swear I'm gonna blow your mind later with this curve, because we found something that is just so cool about this curve. So this is another way of looking at global data, okay? So if we look at the rightmost here, which reflects, pretty recently, what they're saying is the Americas are contributing that much to the total number of reported cases in the world. Europe is experiencing the much bigger fraction of what we're currently experiencing. Southeast Asia here, Eastern Mediterranean, and Western Pacific here. So it's an interesting way to look at what areas of the world we're experiencing the highest number of reported cases at any given time. And then the solid line there is the global deaths. So again, kind of an interesting slide, but it does require a little bit of explanation. And then this website is pretty cool because you can pick any 6 states, up to 6 states, and compare their incidence curve over time. So I picked California, Florida. California and Florida I put in there basically as mental references, okay? Because whether it's COVID-19 or whatever, they both are kind of have issues on both sides. So I put California, Florida, Kentucky, North Carolina, Ohio, and Tennessee, as kind of a regional marker as well. And the interesting part about this is, if you look at the peaks of, a year ago and the most recent peak, that's Tennessee. Okay, and this is per 100,000. This isn't total number of cases. So when you show graphs that have the data expressed in per 100,000, that means that the population of the state doesn't make any difference. Yeah, there's a whole lot more people in California than there are in Tennessee, but the number of cases we had per capita was more than any of these 6 states. And there's a reason for that too. But that is Ohio is going up right there, and currently in second place, in first place right now. But what this tells me, and you won't ever see this in the newspaper, is that these curves are all pretty similar in shape. Maybe not completely similar in magnitude, but they're pretty similar in shape. So one way to look at that is, and keep in mind, all these states did different things. You know, masking, social distancing, business closures, things like that. They all did them differently and at different times. So one could almost make the case it didn't matter what we did. This was going to happen. Okay, you won't read that. At least not yet. There's going to be a lot of armchair epidemiologists out there who, over the course of the next 10 years, can you imagine the sheer tonnage of published papers about, you know, the broad concept of COVID-19? I can hardly imagine that. But I'm almost beginning to wonder whether all that was worth it. You know, church service closures, business closures, people's livelihood. I don't know. It doesn't look like it. It's kind of depressing when you look at that. You know, was the economic impact of COVID-19 mandatory? I don't know.
Sure affected the way people live.
It sure did, and still does.
It will.
And you're right, will continue to do so. So this is a different style of curve, and I'll explain this. But and I don't think I'm reaching anything. You know, this is the university here is in this community. We know that. What happened to Lincoln Memorial is not a big secret, but this is what we have seen at Lincoln Memorial. So far, oh shoot, I took the numbers off. So far we've had, I think it's 672 cases over the whole period at Lincoln Memorial. We've had one death of a staff member. Everybody else has recovered. So this is a cumulative curve. Okay, so it will never go down. At best, it will flatten out. This is this summer. Okay, this is this past summer, where there weren't that many people on campus. And so if they had gotten COVID while they were wherever they were, it didn't get reported here, unless they felt like reporting. Some did, most didn't probably. But regardless, we did not have very many people on campus over the summertime. So when we came back, and we all knew it was going to happen, the slope of the curve went up again. And now we're approaching another plateau, just in time for Thanksgiving and then Christmas. So it's going to have another plateau, but I don't think it's going to be that big. But that's currently, to date, what we have experienced at Lincoln Memorial as well. So I put this on here because, first of all, it's interesting. In November of 2 years ago, right now, there were 38 vaccine candidates in phase 1 clinical trials, 17 in phase 2, 12 in phase 3. Vaccines approved for earlier limited use, there were 6 of them, and none were approved even on emergency use authorization 2 years ago. Remember, it wasn't until the very end of 20 that those vaccines were approved in the United States for emergency use authorization, okay? Now, 2 years later, we're in the hundreds of vaccine candidates. And we've already got the 3 that performed pretty well. 2, in my opinion, performed way better than the other one, but even if we only had the 1, it's still a very effective vaccine, okay? So Operation Warp Speed, if you remember, was the name of the Trump administration's program to generate vaccines against this new disease. And it worked, folks. I mean, certainly in my lifetime, and nothing I've ever read was it an all hands on deck in the scientific community against a single, even HIV, I don't think generated that single focus. But the technology that went into this unprecedented effort is already resulting in some pretty cool things. Moderna, one of the vaccine manufacturers, is about to release or about to apply for licensing for an HIV vaccine. That's pretty cool. And I just read this morning where the mRNA technology, there's 3 vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson, which is more of a traditional type vaccine. Then there's the 2 messenger RNA or mRNA viruses or vaccines that are the Moderna and the Pfizer, okay? And the mRNA technology, there's a lot of folks out there that would like you to believe that that's brand new, that it was the first time it was using COVID-19 and we don't have any experience with it and it's killing people and there's no way I'm getting that vaccine. The truth is that vaccine technology has been out for almost 30 years. And it's been used in other vaccine applications as well, but not with the notoriety that the COVID-19 vaccines have received, okay? But this morning I read where they've recently developed an mRNA vaccine against Lyme disease, okay? And Jan, this is pretty cool. And all of us, because we're living in Tick Central in Tennessee, okay? And so what the technology of this mRNA vaccine is, it renders these individuals toxic to ticks. It doesn't protect you from Lyme disease specifically. It protects you, it kills the ticks that bite you. So what that means is it's not a Lyme disease vaccine. It is a tick-borne disease vaccine. It goes way beyond Lyme disease.
You get any disease.
Any tick-borne disease, it will be protected.
Because it gives a tick.
And it reduces the tick population, at least by one, the one that got you. So that's pretty cool.
Can it be used on animals?
I'm sorry. Yes, in fact, they tested it on animals, and so
That's gonna be great for dogs.
that's going to be great for dogs, and it's going to be great for people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tick-borne diseases on the planet is a really bad thing. Way worse than COVID-19. So anyway, kind of cool. Operation Warp Speed did exactly what it was intended to do, except for one thing, and I was not pleased about this. Operation Warp Speed didn't do much on treatments, antiviral treatments. It was all vaccines all the time.
Yeah.
And I think there should have been, and finally we're catching up a little bit on the antiviral treatments. And I'll say this, I already gave you, the warning that there's a few opinions in here. But when I first, read about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin is a drug, well, I'm familiar with both drugs, but I've administered probably several thousand gallons of ivermectin because it's such a wonderful drug against worms, both internal and external parasites. And we've known about that, gosh, even my full veterinary career, which is a long time. And so when I heard that, ivermectin was being touted as a potential treatment or even a preventative for COVID-19, I read about it thinking, it doesn't make sense. So I read about it, and what one of the mechanisms of cellular action of ivermectin is, it renders the cell membrane less permeable to almost anything, okay? Which would mean it is at least partially effective against COVID-19. Now, is it as effective as President Trump wanted us to think it was? Probably not, but is it more effective than drinking a glass of water? No, do both. Drink a glass of water because you probably need it to begin with, but also, there's at least some logic behind ivermectin. I'm not so sure. I didn't delve into it as much on the hydroxychloroquine, but I'm guessing there's something there other than snake oil, or it wouldn't have been touted by somebody, of some repute, hopefully. So anyway, just a kind of a quick side comment on some of these things that have been touted as, now, anybody drinking bleach for COVID-19, that's crazy, okay? Ivermectin, I think, is a lot less crazy, actually. I've not taken ivermectin for this or anything, but I think there may be some value in at least looking at it.
Wouldn't it have to be the strength of it lessened or something?
Well,
Possibly.
yes,
I mean,
yes.
not just go
I
to
think
the drugstore and buy worm medicine.
No, that would not
I mean, that's what
be
people
right.
were doing.
Right, that's what people are doing. What I'd rather see happen, and what I'm hoping is happening, I want to know the mechanism of action of whatever ivermectin does to make that cell membrane less permeable, then use that as the basis of another drug.
Yeah.
You know, not ivermectin, okay? Okay, enough on this slide. So we have the Pfizer vaccine. Another thing that people said, you know, hasn't been tested. Well, it's been tested probably more than any other new vaccine in US history. You know, tens of thousands of people with no significant adverse effects in their testing, you know, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. It protects, it's stimulated by the spike protein that's on the surface of the COVID-19 virus itself. It's not a whole virus. It doesn't even contain much of anything, you know, as far as a sequence of any virus. So the one thing I feel safe in saying is this: there is zero chance that you're going to get COVID-19 from the vaccine. Zero chance. Okay, it's just not going to happen. And it was approved earlier this year for 12 and above, and since then, I think it's been approved for 5 to 11 on an EUA, you know, emergency use authorization as well. So then there's the Moderna vaccine, another mRNA vaccine. It has shown to be slightly more effective. It has a greater concentration of what we refer to as the antigen in the vaccine, which may be why it's a little bit more effective. And it's just a really good vaccine, in my opinion. And then there's the Johnson & Johnson. The huge advantage of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is it's one shot. You know, the other ones are either 3 or 4 weeks in, 2 shots with 3 or 4 weeks in between. The J&J vaccine is one shot. It's fairly effective. You know, when I say 72%, I knew from my contacts at the Department of Health and Human Services that the United States was going to buy anything that had over 50% effectiveness. Anything over 50%. And it turns out we have 3 that are between 75 and 95% effectiveness. So again, in my opinion, that's more evidence that Operation Warp Speed worked really well. So if we look at vaccine delivery and administration in the United States, this is where it gets a little problematic, okay? This is the total doses administered in the United States up through yesterday from the time we started, okay? So we had this initially, you know, gotta get that vaccine, don't want to die, don't want my kids to die, don't want my grandparents to die. Then the people that wanted the vaccine got it. Then we started encountering, oh, it makes you magnetic. It interferes with cell towers.
Glow in the dark.
Yeah, glow in the dark. I mean, you name it. There were people that,
Tracking
in fact,
devices.
there is a physician in Ohio
Yeah.
who says that you become magnetic and that you interfere with cell towers, and that, you know, your cell phone isn't going to work because you received the vaccine. There's other people that say it inserts little nanobots so the government can track you know, after you receive the vaccine. You know, I mean, these people are flat out crazy. Okay, I'm sorry, and I know crazy is not an appropriate term. It's not a.
Yeah, it is.
So here we are. We're kind of struggling with vaccine administration right now. You know, we have bathtubs full of this stuff, and people are not receiving it, which I think is really, really unfortunate.
What do you see with the increase due to the range that's been approved?
Yes, I think great point. There were 2 things that caused the most recent uptick in vaccine acceptance. One is the surge in cases again, but another one was the Pfizer vaccine has been fully FDA approved. And it didn't change. You know, I mean, the vaccine's the same as it was when it was first released. It just received full FDA approval. And in some people's minds, that was enough for them to say, okay, I'll go get it now.
Is
Jan?
the Biden mandate a factor in this?
Not yet,
Okay,
not yet. It may be,
okay.
but it's not yet. And what she's referring to is, and I'm gonna give you some bad news. I'm gonna give you some bad news, Jan.
Uh-oh.
It's not gonna hold up in the courts.
The Biden administration, and neither of the administrations that I have just mentioned, Trump or Biden, are all bad or all good. You know, there's certain elements of both that I was excited about. There's certain elements of both that I thought, are you kidding me? You know, and so, but I do agree with the fairly controversial Biden administration's mandate for any employer that has more than 100 employees, that they have to be vaccinated. They're-
Or get tested.
Or, you know, if they receive an exemption, they do need to be tested. I agree with that. Not everybody does. But that being said, yesterday, the Fifth Circuit Court in the United States put a legal pause on that. So it was scheduled to become law on January 5th or 7th, 4th, something like that. First week of January. It is now on hold.
OSHA just put it on hold too.
Yeah, yeah. So in fact, that's how they did it, was through the OSHA teeth on it. So anyway, stand by, assuming it lives through these legal hurdles. Can you see, should I move this? Okay. So we'll see what happens. I think you're exactly right, that the FDA approval did change some people's minds. In the United States, a little more than Moderna. You know, Pfizer has been the most common vaccine administered in the United States, followed kind of closely by Moderna. Johnson & Johnson's a distant third. And so here at the top, what this shows is that 68.7% of all Americans, regardless of their age, are fully vaccinated. Either 2 doses of one of the mRNA vaccines or 1 dose of the J&J vaccine. That's 2/3, folks. It's not enough, okay? There is a formula, mathematical formula, to kind of determine how much of the population you have to immunize to really slow or even potentially stop an epidemic. And for COVID-19, it's above 68.7%, okay? If we look at the population of this 12 or older, it's 80%, because now we've had, you know, more younger people get the vaccines. Population over 65 is almost 100%.
Yay.
Exactly. I just think people with more life experiences get it
There's more.
better.
They're also most at risk.
Exactly, exactly.
They
When you
do have
know-
a vested interest.
If we were, that's perfect way to put that. You know, if we were to look at a fractionation of the cases, or of the deaths by age, the older cohorts have died at a much faster rate, if you will, than those who are younger. Not a big surprise. I mean, there's lots of diseases that manifest that same type of thing, but,
No compromise to begin with.
right, right. So, another kind of convoluted slide. Now, this shows just categorically where in the United States are they doing really well for vaccine receipt, and where they're doing not so well. You know, this region right here, which includes Tennessee, is, aside from 0, it's the lowest, you know, fraction of the population that's been immunized. And I'll show you the exact numbers here in just a moment, but New England has done really well. The far west has done almost as well. And then, you know, the rest of it is kind of a hodgepodge, but we've got this, you know, this area right here that is just kind of lagging for whatever reason. And when I say whatever reason, there's a lot of reasons that result in that depiction. So if we were to look at Tennessee, this is the shape of the Tennessee epidemic curve alone, which from a shape standpoint is very similar to that of the United States, which I showed a few slides ago. But the peaks are way higher in Tennessee when you look at it on a per 100,000 basis. We've had more cases than other places, probably because of that relatively low rate of vaccine acceptance. in Tennessee, 49% are fully vaccinated, as opposed to 68.7, or, yeah, 68.7 in the United States. So we're 20 points, which means we're not even close. And if we look at Claiborne County, we're 40% vaccinated in Claiborne County, which is embarrassing. It's really low. No, that's not slowing transmission down very much. And so far, as of this morning, Claiborne, wait a minute, that's not right.
That's not-
Those three, the 34.4 new cases per 100,000, that is,
We have 115 deaths.
115 deaths. and-
Right. Yeah.
I was gonna
You know,
say-
my computer, I just bought a new computer, okay, I haven't installed it yet, and the reason I got the new computer is some of my keys aren't,
No, it's not working.
so I was typing pretty quickly. So sorry about that. Yeah, I'm off by a factor of 10. Yeah, on the deaths, I'm off by a factor of 10. Thank you for catching that.
I looked it up.
Not intentionally, my finger touched that, it just didn't record it. So that begs the question of, why are we not getting vaccinated? Which has always been a really interesting question for me, you know, and it's not just vaccinated, but why don't we do this or that? You know, whether it's wearing our seatbelts or, you know, whatever, you can fill in the blank. It's always a relevant question to ask, why do we not do that, okay? So specific to COVID-19 immunizations, about 4% of those that were surveyed said, the reason I'm not getting the vaccine is I don't believe the healthcare system treats me fairly. And so this is my form of protest by not getting the vaccine, which is completely nonsensical, but
Yeah, eating up was stupid.
exactly, exactly. And these folks right here tend to be, and these are gross generalizations, I get that, younger, lower income, essential workers, and essential workers means people who come pick up the trash, people who deliver your mail, you know, I mean, those are essential functions, which we've come to realize in the past couple of years. And they tend to be more black than other cohorts, and they tend to live in inner cities. Then there's the COVID skeptics, who more, 14% or so, they believe at least one conspiracy theory about either the pandemic, the virus itself, or the vaccine. They tend to be, and you know, I've always in my life, bearing a little bit of personal honesty, I've always tended to be pretty conservative. I'm finding that when people ask me what my, you know, on those rare occasions that somebody will ask, I'll still say conservative. I just say Republican less than I used to. Because as Republicans, I think we're doing some stupid things. You know, not everybody, but being conservative is more of a vanilla label than a Republican these days, in my opinion, for whatever reason. And living in rural areas, you know, is where you'll see more COVID skeptics. And living here just for the past 2.5 years that Catherine and I have had the absolute pleasure of living here, I believe that. And that's not a negative comment, it's just a cultural attribute of places like around here. So, and there's this political divide, which I've already alluded to. 41% of Republicans say they do not plan to get vaccinated, and only 4% of Democrats say they do not plan to get vaccinated. That's a big difference. So these are some opinion slides, because people ask me all the time, what has gone well, or where did we go off the rails, you know, on our response? So these are some slides I put together. First of all, the responses were pretty quick. You know, after the government of China informed the World Health Organization on, I think it was December 31st of 2019, that, hey, we've got this little disease here, you know, seems to be transmitted amongst people, but we're not too worried about it. And then, but it was just a few weeks later that COVID-19, or at first they called it the Asian flu, or the China flu, if you remember, the China virus, because it lacked a name. Okay, so you could call it what you wanted. But there, regardless of what its name was given, there was a pretty quick recognition that it was that it was spreading throughout much of the world early on. So that, in my opinion, the system worked. And in a lot of cases, our elected officials did reach out to medical people to say, look, I don't know that much about this, but I need to get smarter and I need you to advise me on what the options are from a political standpoint. That worked fairly well. Dissemination of large amounts of information worked almost too well, because if you open up your browser, there's no filter that says this is complete BS and this is the truth, you know? And the complete BS sources were outnumbered by a factor of way too many, the sources of truth. And if you remember, a year and a half ago, a little more than a year and a half ago at this point, remember the phrase flatten the curve? We were gonna close businesses, we're gonna, social distancing, because we want to flatten the curve. And by flattening the curve, we wanted to bring that incidence curve down a little bit, not to so much stop the epidemic, but to preserve our ventilator capacity, if you remember, and our ICU bed capacity. Those are the two things that we have in fairly short supply in the United States. So we wanted to spread the diseases out over a longer period of time, so the medical system would be able to handle the cases. And anybody want to venture a guess as to whether we were successful in that or not?
We did flatten it for a while.
We did. You're
But
exactly
then-
right.
But then the new virus came.
So we did flatten the curve. That resulted in a lot of, people patting themselves on the back and saying, wow, we're glad that worked. So then, in my opinion, that's where we went off the rails.
We flattened a lot of other curves too.
Well, we did.
There weren't any school shootings when there weren't schools.
Well, that's true too.
Or church.
Yeah, but specific to COVID-19, I think the reason, why we went off the rails was, a lot of people thought, well, we can flatten the curve, we can stop this epidemic. Folks, that was never on the menu of options. In reality, you cannot stop an epidemic of a disease that's that transmissible. So I think we got a little bit greedy and the expectations went too high. And then when the expectations were not met, and then we began to see, what we're still seeing, and this is completely explainable to a certain extent, and that is, people got tired of being at home. They got tired of not interacting with people, even people they didn't know. I mean, yes, friends and family members, but we were limiting the number of times we went to Food City. We were limiting the number of times we went anywhere. And the human psyche is not built for that, okay? And so we got a little crazy, collectively. George Floyd was killed. We saw all these things and the event was bad enough, but what that triggered was way out of scale, nationwide. The death was, shouldn't have happened. But the response of, burning down cities, I'm not sure how valuable that was. In fact, I'm really sure I do know how valuable it wasn't. So it's just a reflection of the fact that we're not built to not communicate with each other like this. Zoom has been really good, but it ain't replacing life, okay? And there have been some attempts to do that. And again, vaccine development and ventilator production. One of the reasons early on that you couldn't buy a truck or a car in the United States is General Motors and Ford shut down production to build ventilators. Well, the good news is we didn't need that many ventilators. The bad news is that, coupled with then the lack of computer chips, you still can't buy a truck. So anyway, so other things that could have gone better, more effective messaging, duh. That's tough though. You know, it's easy for anybody to stand here and throw spears at bad messaging. But having had some experience in dealing with a local population that's angry and scared, and you being the only Centers for Disease Control epidemiologist that's there investigating, that's hard to do. It's hard to craft your message in a way that doesn't get your tires slashed. So that's tough, and I recognize that. Flattening the curve, we thought we could take that even further and halt transmission and stop the epidemic, or stop the pandemic. Never was possible. Confusion between what is public health guidance and what is law, you know, that's been a gargantuan problem and remains so. I've got my own opinions on how we ought to do it next time, but unless somebody asks, I'll keep it to myself. So, under emphasis on treatment, I mentioned that before. You know, now we're beginning to see some good work being done on treatments, but if it had been part of Operation Warp Speed, we'd probably have more. Public anger over unjustified interventions. You know, I think the whole United States needs a refresher on civics. You know, on Constitution 101, when they say, it's unconstitutional for you to tell me I have to wear a mask when I fly, or it's unconstitutional for you to tell me that my business needed to be shut down for whatever period of time. You know, guess what, folks? It's constitutional as hell. It is completely constitutional. Let me tell you why. And it's so simple. It's so simple. This isn't some law that's buried, that is only dragged out. But the Constitution talks about a lot of things. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech. You know, even the Second Amendment has a message in it, okay? And that's lasted the test of time. Then comes the 10th Amendment. Because, you know, all the amendments were realizations that there was something that was not in the Constitution that the original framers didn't foresee, okay? Completely believable. So then they started amending the Constitution. The 10th Amendment, which is a very important amendment, says, and this is almost a quote, it's really short, anything that is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution is hereby delegated to the states. Which is why there's no National Health Department. Which is why there's no national health insurance. National health insurance in the United States would be unconstitutional, flat out unconstitutional. So in the United States, we don't have one health department. We've got 54. You know, we've got the 50 states and 4 territories. So, and every state has complete legal jurisdiction unless there's a federal mandate on a specific thing. But even that skirts constitutionality. So when people say that's not constitutional, they're wrong, but you don't know whether they're wrong because they're just stupid or they want you to think that you're stupid. That, you know, by their will, they're going to make you believe that. It is not true.
Politicians have been doing it for decades.
Exactly. This is not new, folks. This is not new, but we haven't seen it with such consistent force as we've had in the last 2 years.
Ignorance is not bliss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, multi-species disease surveillance. You know, I'm a veterinarian. Dr. Zieren's a physician. Dr. Thompson's a veterinarian. What Randall Thompson and I do as veterinarians, and what Dr. Zieren does as a physician, doesn't communicate as much as it needs to. Because COVID-19 is a disease that we refer to as a zoonotic disease. Zoonotic diseases are those diseases that are passed back and forth between humans and animals, okay? The vast majority of diseases on Earth are transmitted between people and animals. So I learned about rabies, and now I teach about rabies, but I don't teach the medical students. Now, I'm not saying that's not, you know, I'm not saying I have to teach the medical students, but I would love to see some more shared education. Because what I need to know about rabies and what a physician needs to know about rabies is pretty much the same. Because as veterinarians, how many animals have you treated, Randall, for rabies, trying to cure them or bring them back?
None.
None. We don't treat rabies,
None.
okay?
Just
But
give the
I've
humans a
killed some
shot.
rabid animals.
Exactly, that. We get rid of those animals that are either rabid or known exposed to another rabid animal, unless they're somebody's pets. And then there's a quarantine option. But that's exactly what a physician needs to know. So there's lots of diseases like that unfortunately our educational systems and our post-graduation professions don't talk enough. So, that's one of the deficits that we've come to realize, and we've known that for a long time. And there's this relatively new movement called the One Health concept, which is gaining traction. I hope it continues to do so, because I think you're going to see some blurring, not erasing the lines, but blurring in some ways what is construed as a medical educational piece of knowledge and what's considered a veterinary. And then the third would be environmental. That's even farther down the road, but it's still on the plan. So that was something that has not gone well. So the other thing that didn't go well for a lot of people is a lot of public health officials got fired for really dumb reasons, because people were camped out on the street, on their front lawns. I know Dr. Amy Acton personally, and she had armed people on her front lawn vowing to kill her husband and her children when they came out. And so she eventually resigned. She's not stupid, okay? And Michelle Fiscus got fired here in Tennessee. Sonia Angel in California got fired. So, and these are just three. There have been at least 300 public health officials that have been fired because of the public's mistrust and misunderstanding of, and part of that is back to the messaging. Did the public health community do an effective job of messaging? It got lost. True public health messaging got lost in the weeds. You were hearing way more from people with, tinfoil hats. Then we can talk just for a minute about where did the virus come from? That's still a debate. And I know it's a debate, which is why I included this slide. This is Dr. Francis Collins, who was the director of the National Institutes of Health. He was Tony Fauci's boss, okay? Dr. Collins, when he was the director, said, genomic study points to natural origin of COVID-19. But there was little data behind that statement that proved that was true. Now, in all fairness to Dr. Collins, proving that is almost impossible. Unless you can match it to this animal, to this human, and it's the exact same genetic sequence, which just isn't going to happen. Short of that, you can't prove it. But he came out and said that all the evidence points to the fact that this is a natural introduction of a new virus. So Dr. Robert Redfield, who a month and a half earlier was the director of CDC, but when he made this statement, he was no longer the CDC director. So he could say what he wanted without fear of getting fired or going to jail. And what he said was, I'm of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory. And Catherine will tell you that soon after we recognized that not only was there this new disease, but the epicenter, the original 4 cases, worked at this laboratory in Wuhan, China. And having been a member of the intelligence community in the past and done some traveling to some former Soviet laboratories, my first response was, this was an accidental release from the lab. I mean, flat out. I still believe that to my core today. Could I be wrong? Yes. but I believe it.
Makes the most sense.
It does make the most sense. I don't think it was intentional. And intentional
Better not
means, if it were intentional, we would have expected it to be released somewhere else,
Yeah.
other than right around the lab that was working on it. And what then muddied the waters was the fact that the United States funded much of the research that they were doing in that Wuhan lab, because it was illegal to do it in the United States.
I saw something in the paper today, somebody's about, they're still talking about bats.
Oh, clearly, bats. Bats are the known reservoir for many, many, many viral diseases. Coronaviruses, we've long known that bats are harboring coronaviruses. And, SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus of COVID-19, is going to be no different. I mean, it's going to stay in the bat population on this globe forever. But it didn't start there, at least in my opinion. It's going there because that's where it will naturally reside, along with a lot of other coronaviruses and a lot of other viruses, like rabies virus, okay?
Before you go on, you were talking about messaging,
Yeah,
note the dates.
yeah,
Diametrically opposed positions from
On the
two of
same
the
day.
leading figures
yeah,
on the same day.
yeah, not an accident, I should have brought that up, thank you. Yeah, the immediate ex-director of the CDC, and we're all taught that whatever the CDC director says is coming from the burning bush. I don't know about that, I used to work there. I used to work there. Not to say that nothing is good done there. There's a lot of things that are good done at CDC. I think they were put into the, CDC historically has not, and I'm almost done, folks, I'm sorry.
You take all the time you want.
Yeah, we're not going anymore.
CDC is not a regulatory agency. USDA is, FDA is, EPA is. CDC typically, historically, has not been a regulatory agency, so they are not comfortable with that. They're not experienced in it. But they were thrust into that role. And that was a mismatch. It was a mismatch.
What about the National Institute of Health? They do
Um,
different things. And then, I think a lot, I just wonder what you think about in the beginning, we were just finding out about it. And so many people think because the message changed,
The message is,
that the message was no good.
right.
And they were learning new stuff all
Sure.
the time, so.
The messaging always changes because it has to.
And, in medicine, it happened.
And I'll say this in at least partial defense of Dr. Anthony Fauci. And that is, February of 2020, when we knew that there was something bad coming and that it was respiratory, but it wasn't here yet. He came out and said, no, we don't have to wear masks yet. Or he didn't say yet, he said, we don't have to wear masks, which at that time was exactly correct. Fast forward a month and a half, 6 weeks.
We found out we needed.
Then he said, oh, we need a mask. So then the media pundit said, well, he's flip-flopped. Nothing he says can be trusted. Well, when you gain new knowledge, which we're still doing, but we were doing at a heck of a rate at that time, your messaging has to change because you've got new knowledge. Yes, sir.
I had a colonel I worked for one time that said, I will always tell you the truth. It is, however, incumbent upon you to remember that sometimes the truth changes.
That's a really good way to put that.
In a case like this, that's kind of what happened, is the truth changed.
That's the best way of putting it. Thank you. The truth does change because the truth is based on what we know at the time. Okay, so I'm not done yet with the people who said, where it came from. This guy says it originated from a meteorite from panspermia, in which organic matter travels through space and contain viruses or bacteria that manage to penetrate the Earth's atmosphere because it penetrates all celestial objects. And it's only a matter of time till it comes here, and it did. So this guy says it came from outer space. I'm not convinced.
You live.
I was gonna say that might be where he came from.
Nobody knows. I didn't know those came from yet.
So if we consider the One Health approach, which I kind of mentioned a little bit a moment ago, And I mentioned that, almost 3/4 of all new diseases are passed between humans and animals. And so we need to do a better job of disease surveillance in animals from a global perspective. We do a fairly good job in the United States, but not really. But we're still better than most other countries in the world in doing animal disease surveillance. Should we do it because we love the animals? Well, the answer is yes, but that's not the only reason. We also love human beings, and that's why you do animal disease surveillance. So, all right, that's enough of my slide. So, and One Health isn't so simple as animal health, human health, ecosystem health. Then we look at the global context, culture. When I was in Central Africa in the mid-1990s on a large Ebola outbreak, we had to couch our messaging with local religious leaders, local civic leaders. And see, that's not the American way. We're not comfortable with that because we have grown up in a culture that says there is a complete firewall between politics and religion. And so it's to the point now where we don't even question that. But you go to Central Africa, and if you only do your messaging from a scientific standpoint and don't include the religious leaders, you're wrong. You're stupid. And it took us a little while to realize that. So the messaging, it's back to the messaging a lot of times. We can do better. So there is now a bill before Congress called Advancing Emergency Preparedness Through the One Health Act of 2021. And it requires interagency coordination between the Department of the Interior, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Agriculture. I will almost guarantee you this won't become law.
They don't play well together.
Right. When I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, if there was a major disease outbreak, be it human or animal, I was in charge more than the Department of Agriculture was in charge. And how do you think they liked that? No, I was public enemy number one at USDA, just by virtue of having the job I had. So this is pretty interesting. This is the epidemic curve in the United States that I kind of showed you before. This is the epidemic curve of the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. They're almost,
Superimposed on
Yeah.
top.
they're superimposed, which I just think is historically pretty cool. So we've been here before. Not we. But the United States and the world has been here before. And there's a phrase that in the book called The Great Influenza, which is a wonderful book about the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. The Great Influenza by John Barry. In the book, he says, when the dying ends, the forgetting begins. And that's happening already. And we're not even done with this pandemic yet, but it's happening already. Oh, read this real close.
John and Patsy.
I saw this, I looked up COVID jokes, and that said, Frank and whatever, and so I just.
Except for your green mask.
I like it.
So we've also come to, at least for a short time, value our medical providers. I'd like to think that's going to continue, forever. Probably not. So that is what I have, that's what I came prepared to talk about. Do I have any questions about anything?
That was wonderful.
I think we've asked them as we went along.
Okay, that's good. We are seeing that it's not enough to be smart. It's not enough to know deep in your heart what the right thing to do is, convincing the rest of the population is almost always in the too hard to do box. Yes, sir.
One thing you said, that the children mostly are vaccinated now.
Not mostly, but there's a fairly high percentage of it, yeah.
Yeah, I just thought they just started getting vaccinated.
Right, right. There is a higher fraction of younger folks getting vaccinated than initially adults, okay? Or certainly more kids than adults right now, for sure. But the problem, people under 12 rarely get real sick.
But they pass it on.
They can pass it on. You never hear that so much. People say, well, my kids don't need vaccinated and they should go to school because they don't get sick. Well, guess what? They go home to their parents, or maybe even their grandparents, and that's a whole different population. So vaccinating kids will protect the older populations. That should be the message.
I have a non-human question.
I'm ready.
What about the gray cats who have gotten COVID? How are we treating them?
They're not killing them. They're sequestering them. And a lot of times these are in zoos. Zoos are really good surveillance areas. And the number of big cats is actually not that many. You know where they're finding COVID-19? Much more consistently. And this should scare folks. You know where we're finding COVID-19? Deer.
Ooh, in this area, that's scary.
Yeah.
In North America, that's scary.
Yeah.
It's just like having rabies in the raccoons and the bats and the
Yeah.
ones that's in there.
Yeah.
Good point.
Now, it's something
So,
that-
and guess where they're finding them, at least initially, in the highest numbers, is in Ohio. Now that's due to one of two things. Either Ohio's looking, and nobody else is yet, or it's really only there, at least initially. But it'll do the same thing in the deer population as it did in the human population. But that's the most, you're exactly correct about the big cats early on, but their transmission rate seems to be really low. The deer population, the transmission rate seems to be really high.
Can it be passed on from a dead deer to you?
It would have to be a fairly fresh kill.
What about hunters that eat venison?
Yeah, it's not a foodborne disease. It's not a foodborne disease, but it's gonna be, but if you're the one dressing that deer out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But you'd have a giant reservoir that would be there forever if it infects that
Exactly right.
population.
No, but if you want to kill the.
There's only been 2 diseases in the whole history of the world that have been truly eradicated. And both of those diseases only had one host. When you add hosts or when you add susceptible species, then they quickly shift into what we refer to as the non-eradicable disease category. We'll never eradicate rabies. Never. We'll never eradicate any coronavirus because there's just too many species that they affect. Smallpox was eradicated, and not Rift Valley fever.
Polio?
No. Randall, it's a cattle.
Polio is close, but
It's a cattle disease.
Anthrax? No.
Doggone
It's
it.
not anthrax, not foot mouth.
No. It's primarily an African disease,
Yeah.
not Rift Valley.
Smallpox?
Oh, I feel bad.
Don't think of it as you walk out.
Yeah, I know. Right when it's too late. So, but those are the only 2 diseases that we've ever eradicated. So, great questions. You guys are on your game. I'm impressed.